So you can say Kennedy was tricked into signing the go-ahead for the America to continue nuclear warhead testing program. And that happened on September 15th of 1961. After that, in April 9th of 1962, is when the UN Security Resolution 171 was voted against Israel. So this is also very important. I'm kind of mentioning these things because a lot of people haven't even heard of these UN resolutions. So I think it's just for your own research. You might want to take these names and dates down. So UN Security Resolution 171 passed on April 9th of 1962. It had condemned the actions of Israel. Now, next thing is April 25, 1962. So this was when America started Operation Dominique. This was the nuclear weapons testing. So Operation Dominique took place between April 25 and October 30, 1962. There was 31 nuclear tests done in American soil, blowing up nuclear weapons. And part of that was Operation Fishbowl, which I think most people are familiar with when they were blowing up nuclear bombs up in the magnetosphere.
Instead of helping out, they just made shit worse for themselves, right?
One question I had, this was before Operation Fishbowl, where they were trying to blow a hole in the Van Allen belts in order to try to send their craft through, or their missiles or something like that through. Now, I have looked online and I can't find that anywhere. Is there any truth to this?
No. See, actually, this is what I was going to come to right now, is that you have to look at the next two events very closely. Operation Fishbowl, in the months of June and July, if you read on Wikipedia, it says 5 tests were done in these months, and of those 5, 4 of them failed, and only 1 of them succeeded, and that was Operation Starfish Prime. Starfish Prime was a big explosion, and they claim that the other 4 tests were failures. So they claim that it was just a test to see the influence that the radiation would have as it falls out. That's the official excuse that they get. You can't find them saying, oh, we were trying to blow a hole in the Van Allen belts. No, that wasn't really what it was about. They knew that it was just going to explode and the radiation would fall out and it would affect the magnetosphere. They knew that. But regarding blowing a hole, I don't think anybody would have been that stupid to really believe that they could actually blow a hole, making the problem worse. In the months of October and November, there was 5 more tests. And of these 5, they only say 1 of them failed. And so 4 of them were successful. So they claim that out of the 10 tests, only 5 of them were successful. But we don't really know the truth here. You know, there could have been more tests. But anyway, it was pretty damaging. They realized that it was a big mistake. But the thing is this, when it comes to NASA, this is the most important point. We have on June 7th, 1962, was when von Braun adopted the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous Program. This is the key point. 1962, this was when von Braun agreed to fake it. This is the thing, because before that time, before 1962, you see, von Braun was not a Freemason. Before 1962, these Freemasons were secretly discussing among themselves, hey, let's go ahead and fake it. And they had mentioned this to von Braun, but von Braun was not happy with that. Ever since his childhood, really wanted to go to the moon. So he wasn't happy with this idea of faking it. That's why von Braun, he suggested building a space station. He said, we have to build a space station and send the ships to the space station so they can refuel, and then we can build a really heavy ship to go to the moon. Because the von Braun knew you needed a really heavy ship because of the radiation protection material. So von Braun really wanted to go to the moon. But in 1962, he had to cave in to these Freemasons. And the Freemasons said, no, we're going to have to fake it. and you're going to have to accept that. And if you don't accept that, we're just going to expose you as being a Nazi who was in charge of a death camp. So they were hanging that over his head. We can expose you at any time. So von Braun in 1962 agreed to the lunar orbit rendezvous program. So again, let me just repeat that date because this is the most important thing. June 7th, 1962 was when von Braun agreed to the lunar orbit rendezvous program. That's when the decision was made to fake it. Once von Braun agreed, then it was all green lights from there. The plan to fake it was set into motion on June 7th, 1962. And that was the same time as Operation Fishbowl. Starfish Prime wasn't until July. So that was already after NASA had planned to fake the moon landing. So the theory that NASA had the idea to fake the moon landings came after Operation Fishbowl is totally wrong. No, Operation Fishbowl came later. They had already planned it for a long time, and the plans were set into motion to fake it even before Operation Fishbowl. This is the truth about that. Operation Fishbowl had nothing to do really with the plan of faking it. The plan of faking it was in the works for a long time before that. Operation Fishbowl was just the testing how the radiation would affect and scatter over the ocean and stuff. They could see the fallout coming down on the islands and how many animals would die. That's what Operation Fishbowl was about, how it's going to kill wildlife and stuff. So anyway, it's very important here. June 7th, 1962, that's when von Braun caved in and agreed to adopt the lunar orbit rendezvous plan. Now, what happened in 1962, just after that, in July, Yuri Gagarin started a world tour. He was going to tour around the world as being the first man in space, and Kennedy banned him from coming to America. Kennedy was worried that having Yuri Gagarin is going to be bad for American morale because America was supposedly in the midst of a Cold War now. So back then in July, Kennedy banned Yuri Gagarin from his world tour coming to the U.S. And then in September 26, 1962, JFK sent weapons inspectors to Israel, and they were only given a short tour. So Israel said, no, our nuclear facilities is only for nuclear energy production, not for nuclear weapons production. And so the American weapons inspectors came to Israel, and they were given a short tour and said, see, everything is just for energy production. There's no nuclear weapons going on here. And then they had to leave really quickly. And when they got back to America, they told Kennedy, they said, I don't think Israel treated us very well. We were only given a short tour. So Kennedy started becoming very suspicious of Israel at that time, that they were secretly developing nuclear weapons. So that's a very important date also. All right, then what happened after that? So October 16 was when the Cuban Missile Crisis began. Just after the weapons inspectors in Israel were kind of given the cold shoulder, then the Soviets were told to launch the Cuban Missile Crisis. What is the Cuban Missile Crisis? It was basically an attempted coup to get rid of Kennedy, in simple terms. They weren't happy with Kennedy, and this Cuban Missile Crisis was basically an attempted coup. So that lasted between October 16 and October 27.
Yeah, the Cuban Missile Crisis, that was a very scary time, I'll tell you that. Not a very good time to be in school, let's put it that way. It's called the duck and cover. And you put your head between your rear and kiss your ass goodbye if that missile hits. Everybody was in a lot of fear at that time. And this is in Canada, never mind in the States or anywhere else. Very scary time indeed.
The media was full of propaganda. Oh, the war's coming,
Oh, yeah.
and the kids were told to.
And here was the other thing, too. People were going out digging holes in their backyard and putting shelters in there. And this was a big thing back then because I'll tell you something, there was a lot of vacuum cleaner salesmen, as they used to put it, that went around selling those shelters. You want to put up $3,000 for a shelter? You know how much money that was back then? You could buy a house for $10,000. And people were buying these things and stocking them high with food and ammunition. Crazy
Wow.
time.
Well, now that we've become wake to some of the shenanigans, would you classify the whole time period for the Cuban Missile Crisis as maybe unscientific terms such as fake and gay?
That's actually interesting. That actually comes to my next point, is that this is a very most important thing to understand here. On October 27, 1962, when the Cuban Missile Crisis was over, China broke ties with the Soviet Union. So China said, you guys are just a bunch of bullshitters. So that's a very important, because before 1962, China was getting help from the Soviet Union. But then all of a sudden in 1962, China broke from the Soviet Union and said, you guys are simply puppets. And this whole Cuban Missile Crisis proves that you are puppets. If you go to the Wikipedia page called the Sino-Soviet Split, that's when China broke ties with the Soviet Union. And it was right then during the Cuban Missile Crisis when China just said that you guys are bullshitters. You're just puppets. This is a puppet game, and we don't have anything more to do with the Soviet Union. China became aware that it was all a hoax back then in 1962 because of this Cuban Missile Crisis. This is also the most important point regarding JFK. It took me a lot of research to dig this up. In November of 1962, RFK was acting as the Attorney General of the Department of Justice. So that was the job which JFK had given him, right? JFK had given RFK the job of Attorney General of the Department of Justice. And what JFK and RFK decided to do in November of 1962 was they decided that the American Zionist Council should be registered as a foreign agent. This is the most important thing. If you talk about why was Kennedy assassinated, what happened was he forced the Israel lobby to be registered as a foreign agent. So at the time, their name was called the American Zionist Council. So once Kennedy forced them to be registered as a foreign agent, what they did was they just created a new organization called AIPAC. So AIPAC was created in order to avoid being registered as a foreign agent. If you ask about why was Kennedy assassinated, this is he sent weapons inspectors to Israel, and he also forced the American Zionist Council to be registered as a foreign agent. And also there was Executive Order 11110, where he tried to attack the Fed. So this is why Kennedy was killed.
Yeah, actually, in the documentary, The Bankers, there's a lot of information in that on the Fed and JFK and what was going on in the background, too. I thought that was really interesting, and I don't want to give it away because I think people should really watch that documentary.
Yeah. Coming back to JFK, now there was one other thing he did which really pissed off the Freemasons, and this was in November 21, 1962. There was a meeting between James Webb and JFK. So this is very interesting. You can go to YouTube and listen to this audio. So JFK and Freemason James Webb, who was the administrator of NASA, got into a heated debate with the JFK. And you should definitely listen to this. So basically what was going on was JFK was scolding them for not making the moon landings the priority. He says, I gave you guys too much money for you to be focusing on other projects, going to Venus or going to Mars. No, I want the moon to be first. So JFK was scolding James Webb in this interview, saying, I gave you guys a lot of money. Don't waste it. And so it's very interesting. You can add that to the list of things which JFK did that pissed off the Freemasons. So next is on March 25, 1963, JFK started requesting a third weapons inspectors to come to Israel. So the first weapons inspection was nothing. The second inspection was when they got the short tour, and JFK was not happy with that. And he says, no, we want a real inspection, which he calls the third inspection. That was a very important. It was that on March 25th, 1963, JFK started ordering for this real weapons inspection to go on because he wasn't satisfied with the theory that Israel was not producing nuclear weapons. So then on April 17th, 1963, Israel replied to JFK and they said, well, you see, what happened was a federation just formed between Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. And so, we don't have time right now to let you have this third inspection. So this was the excuse which Israel replied to JFK on April 17th, 1963. And then on May 4th, 1963, JFK sent a letter back to Israel, said, stop changing the subject. I want a third weapons inspection and stop complaining about this blah, blah, blah. So you can actually trace that letter. Finally, then on June 4th, 1963 was Executive Order 11110, where JFK basically attacked the Fed. Now, there's a lot of different people who will say different theories about this. Of course, the mainstream media, like Wikipedia, will say that the Executive Order 11110 was not an attack on the Fed. It was simply just a blah, 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 blah. And they tried to make excuses how this was not an attack on the Fed. It definitely was an attack on the Fed. And it's just the Freemasons today who are in denial of that. He wanted them to not be the ones running the show anymore. They'll try to dodge their way out of it. Oh, no, this wasn't an attack on the Fed. So on June 15th, 1963, JFK sent another letter to Israel demanding again for them to submit to a third weapons inspection. And then again on July 5th, 1963, Kennedy sent another letter to Israel, this time because Israel had received a new prime minister. So JFK was worried. He says, okay, maybe the old prime minister got the old letter, so I'm going to write a new letter to the new prime minister saying you guys have to submit to a third weapons inspection test. And then finally, something I want to mention here is in the month of July 1963, NASA began the test flight of their top secret X-15 spacecraft. This was a classified project. A lot of the NASA trolls will say, oh, NASA wasn't keeping any secrets. Everything NASA was doing was open to the public. No, sorry. If you look at the X-15 secret rockets, so as we mentioned, the first time NASA tried to send astronauts into space was on balloons. And then the next time they sent astronauts into space was on this secret X-15 rocket program they were doing. So this is something that the public wasn't aware of at the time. And it's only that today we can go onto Wikipedia and look up the X-15 launches and who was there. So it's very easy to say, oh, this wasn't classified information. I can read about it on Wikipedia today. No, sorry. This was a classified project. Nobody knew about this back then. So the project began in July of 1963, where they were testing out these spacesuits on this secret X-15 rocket. During those tests, they set what's known as the Kármán line. The Kármán line is 100 kilometers at the edge of space. This is where space begins, is once you cross 100 kilometers. So that was during July of 1963. That's when they set the limit of space due to this tests with these X-15 spacecrafts. So this is very interesting. And then finally, in August 5th, 1963, there was a partial nuclear test ban treaty. So the partial nuclear test ban treaty, this is very interesting because it means that Kennedy and the Soviets agreed that we got to stop this testing. Now, why did they do that? Basically, the reason they did that is because they knew that Kennedy's days were numbered. It's like, these are the last few months you're going to be alive, so we're going to let you have the last enjoyable few months. So we'll sign this partial nuclear test ban treaty. And then in August 1963, Israel sent a letter to Kennedy saying, yes, we're eventually going to let you have a third weapons inspection. So they knew that his days were numbered. So they just sent him a letter. Oh, yes, we're going to let you have this third inspection. And then finally, in August of 1963, the Kremlin hotline was completed. So they laid down the cable across the Atlantic that connected the White House to the Kremlin. So that was just before Kennedy was killed. So on September 20, 1963, Kennedy proposed a joint mission to the moon. A lot of people don't even know about this, but Kennedy was like, let's America and the Soviets work together and we can reach the moon faster. The Freemasons were just laughing at this. They didn't even tell the Soviet Union that Kennedy had proposed such a thing. You know, it was so ridiculous because it totally contradicted their Cold War thing. So anyway, this was just 2 months before Kennedy assassination, and they didn't even tell the Soviets that he proposed such a thing. And then 2 months later, November 22nd, 1963, was the Kennedy assassination. Just recently on YouTube, they're really making a lot of these Kennedy videos going viral because I think that the truth is coming out very soon about this. Like, I think the government is basically going to have to be forced to admit that it was an inside job. Let me keep going now. We've got what happened after the Kennedy assassination. On January 30, 1964 was when NASA launched the Ranger 6. And the Ranger 6 was the first successful television camera to hit the moon. You can say it didn't land, it just crashed. What had happened, this Ranger program, they had been trying to send television cameras to the moon, but they all failed because the radiation was destroying the diodes inside of the TV camera circuitry. So they had to change the material of the diodes, and they had made a radiation-proof diode, which then was launched on the Ranger 6 program in 1964. So that was the first time that they had really solved the radiation problem, and they could send a TV camera to the moon. From a perspective of NASA, it was all downhill from there. Their goal was to fake a moon landing, and once they could send a TV camera to the moon, it was all downhill from there. It was just like, okay, once you can get a live TV camera from the moon, then you can do whatever you want. You can put a craft in orbit, you can land a craft on the moon, you can even scoop up rocks and bring it back. You can do all that. That's the downhill battle. The hardest going uphill was just to get the TV camera there, and it's working. So, but actually on Ranger 6, the camera did fail, but it worked well enough so that they could get it right the next time. So then what happened on July 2nd, 1964 was LBJ passed the Civil Rights Act. So this is very important now. LBJ passed the Civil Rights Act. Why? So because these Freemasons, LBJ and all the other Freemasons, they were planning on the Vietnam War. They knew that they had to give the American public what they were asking for. And the American public was asking for the Civil Rights Act. So let's give them that. But we've got some really bad things coming up in store. So it's kind of like make them happy. You know, our Ranger 6 test was successful. So things are looking downhill. So let's give the public a little bit of civil rights. Then finally, on July 28, 1964, the Ranger 7 was when they got the television camera down to the surface, all the way down to the crash. The TV camera was transmitting signals back to Earth. So that was the successful for NASA. They knew that they could pull off the moon landing hoax from that point in July 28, 1964, with the success of the Ranger 7 mission. So what happened after that? After NASA got this successful Ranger 7, what was the next event? The Gulf of Tonkin incident. So it's like, yes, we got the camera onto the moon, so now we can go ahead with the Vietnam War. So in order to get the Vietnam War, they had to get this Gulf of Tonkin incident. So August 2nd was the date they chose for this so-called Gulf of Tonkin incident, which wasn't even really an incident. They just chose that date to say that this incident happened on. They were going to use that later as the excuse to bring America into the Vietnam War. So this was all planned out. So after Ranger 7 was a success, they went ahead with the Gulf of Tonkin planning. And then on October 14th, 1964, Khrushchev was taken out of power. Brezhnev and Kosygin were put into power. So it was just a changing of powers in the Soviet Union. So Kennedy was gone and LBJ was in power in America. Khrushchev was gone. Brezhnev, Kosygin were in power in the Soviet Union. So they had all the perfect puppets in place now to carry out the Vietnam War. What happened after that was November 3rd, 1964, was when Johnson was elected. So that's very important. You know, as you know, Johnson stepped in after JFK was killed, but then he was only acting president until he could finally get elected again. So he had to actually get elected again in order to carry out the plans. You know, there was still some doubt as to whether he would be elected or not, but he was elected on November 3rd, 1964. Sometime between November 1964 and March of 1965 was when there was the big meeting. This was when LBJ called up Brezhnev and Kosygin on the Kremlin hotline, and these two sets of Freemasons got together and they discussed the faking of the moon landing and the faking of the nuclear arms race and the faking of the Vietnam War. All these plans were made out. So that's the big meeting. That's when they said, okay, we're going to supply you with the technology so you can appear to be ahead in the space race, and then we'll pull off the big win with Apollo 11. And we're going to let you pass us in the nuclear arms race. And while all this is going on, we're going to be supplying South Vietnam and you're going to be supplying North Vietnam. This was all planned out. And while you guys are building up North Vietnam, we also want you to build up the space station so that in the future we can meet and make a space station together. So we're going to pretend to be at war for a while you guys are building the space station so that we can then meet up in space later. So this was all planned out at the end of 1964, beginning of 1965. Somewhere between the time of November when Johnson was elected and March of 1965, because March of 1965 was Operation Rolling Thunder. So that's when the U.S. entered the Vietnam War. So sometime between the end of 64, beginning of 65, was when they agreed to, we're going to fake this Vietnam War thing. So Operation Rolling Thunder could begin on March 2nd, 1965.